In Daniel chapter 2, we have God's sovereign rule over Gentile empires demonstrated. Daniel chapter 3, God's sovereign rule over Gentile punishment demonstrated. Chapter 4, God's sovereign rule over Gentile rulers demonstrated. Chapter 5, God's sovereign rule over Gentile defenses demonstrated. Chapter 6, God's sovereign rule over Gentile law demonstrated. We come to Daniel chapter 7, which is the last chapter in this section of God's rule over the Gentiles contained in the book of Daniel. And we could entitle this chapter, God's Sovereign Rule over Gentile Empires Demonstrated Again. In essence, at least in the opening verses of this 7th chapter, we have God revealing to Daniel the same basic truth that he had revealed to Nebuchadnezzar in that king's dream as recorded back in Daniel chapter 2. Now let me give, once again, just some very brief background before we begin to examine the content of this 7th chapter. Beginning in chapter 7 and going through chapter 12, God's prophet records for us a series of dreams or visions that God had given to him. Up to this point, we've seen some dreams that God had given to King Nebuchadnezzar. But now a series of dreams or visions that God gave to his own prophet Daniel. Some of these dreams or visions Daniel received during the events that are recorded in chapters 1 through 6. So he is not presenting these dreams or visions in any set chronological order, but he's presenting them in more of a thematic approach rather than a chronological approach. With that as background, in the first section of Daniel chapter 7, which is contained for us in verses 1 through 14, we have Daniel's vision. Daniel writes, verse 1, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it." Note, please, Daniel is going back to the time when Belshazzar, whom we've already met in Daniel chapter 5, was ruling as sub-king over the land of Babylon. And Daniel says that he received this particular dream or vision during the first year of Belshazzar's reign as king of Babylon. From all we can discern, that was in the year 547 BC that Daniel received this particular dream or vision. And he's telling us that he is presenting this dream or vision to us in summary fashion. In verse 2, Daniel begins to give the actual content of this vision that he received from God. He tells us that he was looking in his vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. No doubt the Mediterranean Sea that he has in mind. He sees the winds stirring up the Mediterranean Sea into a very chaotic condition. Now keep in mind, this is a dream or vision. Therefore, the things that Daniel is witnessing are symbols, but symbols of something very real that actually exists. In the scriptures, when the sea is used as a symbol, as it is in this particular passage, it is used as a symbol of the Gentile world. Therefore, with this particular sea being whipped up into a frenzy, into a very chaotic condition, what is being portrayed for Daniel is the Gentile world in a state of turmoil and uproar or chaos. And as he is observing this sea, he tells us in verse 3 that four great beasts were coming up out of this chaotic sea. Four different kinds of animals, each one distinct from the other three. He begins to deal with the first animal that came out of the sea, out of the Gentile world, and this is referred to in verse 4. He says, "The first was like a lion, and had the wings of an eagle. From our historical perspective today, we know that this winged lion was representing the kingdom of Babylon that was in existence at the time that Daniel received this particular dream or vision. We know again from ancient Babylonian records that a winged lion was the national symbol of the ancient Babylonian Empire. In fact, if we could put you into a time machine today and transport you back to Daniel's day when Babylon was in power, and if you had the privilege of walking up to one of the royal palaces in the capital city of Babylon, you would find that standing on both sides of the major entrances going into the royal palaces would be enormous winged lions carved out of solid stone. They were the national symbol of the ancient Babylonian Empire. And because that was true, God portrayed the Babylonian Empire with that national symbol. A lion, of course, has often been regarded as the king of beasts, and the idea is that it is able to conquer other types of animals. And so, this is what is being portrayed, Babylon as a great conqueror. But why the wings of an eagle upon its back? Wings carry with it the idea of the ability to swoop down upon an enemy with tremendous speed. And so again, this is portraying the fact that Babylon was able to build its empire in a relatively brief period of time. King Nebuchadnezzar, during the first half of his reign, expanded the boundaries of the Babylonian Empire by conquering more and more peoples. But notice, as Daniel is watching this winged lion, he sees that after a while the wings are plucked off of its back, and the lion is made to stand on its hind feet like a human man would stand upon 2 feet. And the heart, or inner control center of a man, was placed into that lion. The idea is the lion was being humanized. What God is portraying here is the fact that although Babylon was noted for its tremendous military conquest during the first half of King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, halfway through Nebuchadnezzar's reign, particularly as a result of God humbling him, as we've already seen in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar stopped his military conquests and was remaining at home and at peace, and began to deal more humanely with the subjects of his kingdom. And that is what God is portraying here with the lion having its wings plucked off its back. No more swift conquests, and being made to stand like a human being and being given a human heart. Military conquests during the early history of the Babylonian Empire, but more humane treatment of its subjects and peace during the latter half, particularly of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. The second beast that Daniel saw coming up out of the sea is presented to us in verse 5. Daniel says, "And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat." This second beast that came out of the chaotic Gentile world of ancient times, we know from our historical perspective today, was the Medo-Persian Empire. As we saw in chapter 2, that was the great Gentile empire that conquered Babylon and assimilated the Babylonian Empire within its own boundaries. This particular beast, God represents as a bear. There's a reason for that. Many kinds of bears are much larger in size than lions. And so God uses an animal that is larger than a lion to represent the Medo-Persian Empire, because that empire ended up being much larger in size than the Babylonian Empire had been. But please note, this bear is raised up on one side. The implication seems to be that one side of the bear is elevated higher than the other side. Again, there's a reason that God portrayed the Medo-Persian Empire that way. We saw in Daniel chapter 2 that the Medo-Persian Empire originally was a partnership empire made up of two distinct national groups of people, the Medes and the Persians, who were united together to form one new kingdom in 550 BC. After a while, one of those partners, namely the Persians, gained the ascendancy in power and control even over the other partner, the Medes. And God, knowing that that would be the case, and here again he's portraying history ahead of time, this is now prophecy, God portrayed the bear with one side higher than the other, the higher side representing the Persian partner, and the lower side representing the Median partner. But notice, this bear has 3 ribs in its mouth. Obviously, the remains of victims that it has devoured. And this is intended to portray the tremendous devouring of other nations and peoples by the Medo-Persian Empire. The fact that this is so is indicated at the end of verse 5, where the bear is given a command, "Arise, devour much meat." But why specifically 3 ribs? Well, it is a fact of history that Medo-Persia, as it expanded its boundaries and enlarged its great kingdom, conquered 3 other great nations or empires. One, of course, as we've already seen, was the Babylonian Empire. That was one of the victims of Medo-Persia. But a second victim was the kingdom of Lydia, a great ancient kingdom that headquartered primarily in the area of the world that we know today as Turkey. But then a third great kingdom that was a victim of Medo-Persian conquest was the kingdom of Egypt. And so these 3 ribs are representing these 3 other Gentile kingdoms that were conquered or devoured by Medo-Persia. But Daniel goes on, and in verse 6, he introduces the third beast that came up out of the sea in his vision. He says, "After this I kept looking, and behold another one, another beast, like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." From our historical perspective today, we know that this third beast, this winged leopard, represents the Grecian Empire that originally was built through the military conquests of Alexander the Great. A leopard is noted for its tremendous speed. And that's exactly why God represents Greece by a leopard. We'll explain that in a little more detail here in a moment. But the idea of speed is increased and heightened with the fact that this particular leopard has 4 wings on its back. If the lion, the first beast, with one set of wings, is being portrayed as an animal of swift conquest, then a leopard, which moves even faster than a lion, that has 2 complete sets of wings on its back, is being represented even more intensely as one that conquers very swiftly. God, again, ahead of time, is portraying the Grecian Empire this way because it is a fact of history that Alexander the Great moved the Grecian armies across the whole Middle Eastern area of the ancient world more rapidly than any of the other of the ancient powers. Alexander the Great was noted for forced marches with his troops. Sometimes would make his men march 25 miles overnight in order to attack an enemy in the morning at the crack of dawn and thereby catch that enemy by surprise. They were noted for lightning-fast movements. Alexander the Great, with his Greek Macedonian army, was able to conquer the area of the world from Greece over in Europe to the western part of India in Asia over a span of only 8 years. From about 334 to 327 BC. Greece conquered that large area of the world. But notice, this leopard, again, was very unique. It not only had 4 wings on its back, but it had 4 heads. Very unusual. But again, God, prophesying ahead of time what would happen in history, was very accurate in his presentation of the Grecian Empire in this fashion. Alexander the Great, who built this great empire, died very unexpectedly while out with his troops when only 32 years of age. And of course the question came, who will take over the control of this great empire now that the original builder of the empire has passed off the world scene? Alexander had 4 leading generals of his Greek Macedonian army. And so when he died, those 4 generals subdivided the Grecian Empire into 4 divisions. And so the 4 heads represent the 4 generals and their 4 divisions of that great Grecian Empire. When we come to verses 7 and 8 of Daniel chapter 7, Daniel's attention in his vision is now drawn to the 4th and final beast that comes out of the chaotic Gentile world of ancient times. He says, "After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth that devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn, this little horn, possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts." This 4th beast that Daniel saw coming up out of the ancient Gentile world in his vision, he says was different from the preceding 3 beasts. How was it different? Well, the other 3 beasts could be represented by an animal that is known by man on the face of the earth. But this particular beast, there was no animal known to man that could fit its description. It is really unique and different. And so we simply have to call this 4th beast a nondescript beast. The first one looked like a lion. The second one looked like a bear. The third one looked like a leopard. But this one did not look like any animal known to man. It was so different. And it would appear that the reason God portrayed this 4th Gentile kingdom this way is because this one would indeed be very unique in the extent of its rule and in the greatness of its power. Daniel describes this beast in such a way as to make it very clear that it is noted for its tremendous strength and its ability to conquer and devour everything that gets into its way. Again, from our historical perspective today, we know what that 4th great Gentile empire was. It's being demonstrated by this 4th and nondescript beast. It is the Roman Empire. But notice, as Daniel observes this beast, his attention is drawn to 3 different aspects of this animal. And this implies to us that the Roman Empire would pass through 3 distinct stages of history in the world. First is what could be called the beast stage. The animal itself, in its giant size, tremendous power, an ability to trample, devour, conquer, destroy everything that gets into its way. I would propose to you that this is representing, this beastly stage, the ancient form of the Roman Empire that has already passed history. And indeed it was noted for its tremendous ability to devour and conquer opponents and other nations and peoples of the world. But there would be a second stage of Rome's history as described by the 10 horns. After Daniel observed the huge body of this 4th beast, his attention was drawn to the 10 horns. Now, thankfully, when we move over to verse 24, an angel interprets the 10 horns for Daniel. The angel says, "As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise." We've already noted when we looked at Daniel chapter 2 that in the Orient, in ancient times, kings and kingdoms were regarded as being synonymous with each other. So that when the people in the Orient in ancient times would talk about their king, they were also at the same time talking about his kingdom. Or when they were talking about a kingdom, they were at the same time talking about the ruler, the king of that particular kingdom. In light of that, when the angel says the 10 horns represent 10 kings, he's indicating that these 10 horns not only represent 10 Gentile rulers, but also 10 distinct kingdoms over which these 10 Gentile rulers would exercise their authority. The implication is that sometime during the history of the Roman Empire, that empire would consist of a 10-nation confederation. I would propose to you that these 10 horns here in Daniel's vision of chapter 7 are parallel to the feet and toes that are a mixture of iron and clay in the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream back in Daniel chapter 2. You will recall that when we looked at that part of the image in chapter 2, that Daniel was told that inasmuch as the feet and toes are a mixture of iron and clay, although the nations making up that phase of the Roman Empire would adhere to each other, would be united to each other to a certain extent, yet the peoples of those nations would not be completely amalgamated with each other. They would remain distinct from each other. And Daniel was told there that that part of the Roman Empire, although it would be united to a certain degree, would also be characterized by divisions. The implication being that sometime during the history of the Roman Empire, it would consist of a 10-nation confederation. 10 distinct nations united together for international purposes and policies in order to be militarily strong to deal with the rest of the world, and yet not totally amalgamated to each other, remaining in their national distinctives and taking care of their own domestic policies within their own spheres of authority. I would submit to you that never in the history of the ancient Roman Empire did it consist of a 10-nation confederation. In light of this, we are forced to conclude that here is a stage of the Roman Empire that is yet future to appear upon the world scene. And as I indicated in our study, there are many who are increasingly becoming convinced that what is being portrayed here is perhaps the common market nations of Western Europe. That is a distinct possibility of what will be the fulfillment of this 10-nation confederation form of a revived Roman Empire in the future. But Daniel goes on in verse 8 and indicates that there would be a third phase of the Roman Empire. He says, "While I was contemplating the horns, behold another horn." In other words, an 11th horn. A little one came up among them, came up among the 10 horns that were already there. And 3 of the first 10 horns were pulled out by the roots before it. He says that eventually the Roman Empire would pass into a third phase of its history, whereas the second phase could be called the 10-horn phase. This third phase could be called the little horn phase, or the 11th horn phase of the Roman Empire's history. Inasmuch as the first 10 horns represented 10 kings, together with their kingdoms, we are to thereby conclude that this 11th or little horn also represents a king with a kingdom, a man who has a kingdom as his sphere of authority. And Daniel is indicating that as this 11th or little horn pushes its way up through the head of this fourth beast, it uproots 3 of the 10 horns that were already there. The implication seems to be that as this man who is represented by this 11th horn rises to power with his kingdom, that he himself will conquer 3 of the 10 nations or kings that were part of the 10-nation confederation of the revived Roman Empire, as he himself is coming to power. 2 interesting things that Daniel tells us about this 11th horn in verse 8. For one thing, he says that it possessed eyes like the eyes of a man. Remember again, this is a vision. And so this horn with eyes all over it is symbolic of something very real. In the scriptures, when eyes are used as symbols, they symbolize human intelligence and personality. The implication, therefore, is that this 11th horn is a man who possesses a human personality and human intelligence. But notice something else about this little horn. Even though the horn itself is small, it's got a mouth that is boasting great things way out of proportion for its size. We're going to see later on, when we get into the latter part of Daniel chapter 7, and then we examine some parallel passages in the book of Revelation, that what is being indicated here is this. This last great ruler of the revived future form of the Roman Empire that is yet to come is going to be a blasphemer of the true and the living God. He himself will be a man, but he's going to use his mouth to boast great things about himself, things that are way out of proportion for who he is. And by making those boasts, he will blaspheme the true and the living God. There will be more to be said about this 4th beast, the 10 horns, and this 11th little horn as we move into the latter part of Daniel chapter 7. But Daniel is not yet done presenting to us the content of his vision. Up to this point, what he has been seeing in his night vision are events that will transpire here on planet Earth. But now when we come to verse 9, there is a dramatic shift in Daniel's vision away from the earth to a scene in heaven. And this is what he writes. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads, literally 10,000 times 10,000, were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Daniel's attention all of a sudden is drawn away from the earthly scene of these Gentile world empires and is shifted to a heavenly scene. And what he sees in heaven is thrones being set up, judgment thrones. He tells us in verse 11, this is a courtroom scene. And the judge, the ultimate judge of this supreme court of heaven, is the Ancient of Days. This is a reference to God the Father. Why is he calling God the Father the Ancient of Days in this particular context? Well, the whole concept here is that God the Father, as Ancient of Days, is the one who has been around to observe the whole course of Gentile world history. He is the one who has observed firsthand as an eyewitness the doings, the policies of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And since as the Ancient of Days, he has been a personal eyewitness of what every one of these Gentile world empires has done, he is the one who has the right to judge Gentile world dominion on the face of the earth. And that's what he is about to do. And that is the very purpose of these judgment thrones being set up in heaven. God Almighty, Jehovah the God of Israel, as the sovereign God of history, is about to judge the deeds of Gentile world power here on planet Earth. The fact that his throne is ablaze with flames and the river of fire is flowing out from before his throne, represents the wrath and the holiness of God, which he is about to pour out upon godless Gentile world dominion on planet Earth. And notice, he has 10,000 times 10,000 plus thousands times thousands more of angelic beings standing before him in his throne in heaven, ready to do the bidding of God. The implication being that as God determines how Gentile world dominion is to be judged, these angelic servants of God will do his bidding. All he has to do is give the command, and they will come to the earth and execute the wrath and judgment of God upon godless Gentile world dominion here on planet Earth. By the way, if you multiply 10,000 times 10,000, verse 10, that's 100 million. But in addition, there are thousands times thousands more of angelic beings there as the servants of God to do his bidding. Compare sometime Revelation chapter 5, the latter verses of that chapter, where the Apostle John, who also is privileged by God to be given insight into a heavenly scene, sees these same angels and uses the same terminology, 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands times thousands more of angelic beings there to serve God and do his bidding. Notice the end of verse 10, books are opened. The Bible makes it very clear that God keeps an accurate record of the deeds of human beings, but also the deeds of nations and empires. And it's my understanding that the purpose of God opening these books is to read the record of what Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome have done historically in the world, particularly how have those Gentile powers treated the nation of Israel. And God will judge those nations for that treatment. Now, it's necessary for me to point out to you that this particular judgment that is being portrayed here is not the great white throne judgment that is described for us toward the end of Revelation chapter 20. The great white throne judgment in Revelation chapter 20 is not a judgment of Gentile world powers, it is a judgment of individual human beings. When all the unsaved of all ages of world history will be resurrected from the dead to appear before God and his great white throne after the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ here on planet Earth. And all these unsaved of all ages of world history will be consigned forever to the eternal lake of fire, where they will be in conscious torment under the judgment of God forever because they have never accepted God's way of salvation. But that is not the judgment that is being described here. This judgment that is being described here is judgment of God against Gentile world dominion, particularly as it exists in its last form of the revived Roman Empire on the earth during the last 7 years, immediately before the second coming of Jesus Christ. This is the judgment of God that will be poured out upon Gentile world dominion during the coming tribulation period, as God will pour out one form of divine wrath and judgment after another upon the revived Roman Empire on the face of the earth at that time, and will culminate that judgment at the second coming of Jesus Christ, when Christ will return out of heaven as the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords, and the godless armies of the world will be gathered together here in the valley of Megiddo in Palestine to oppose Christ at his coming rule. And we are told in Revelation 19 that Christ will pour out his wrath upon these godless Gentile forces and will decimate and destroy them. This is the judgment that is being described here. Now, as Daniel observes this judgment scene in heaven, he says something interesting in verse 11. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. The horn to which he refers here is the 11th or little horn that was introduced back in verse 8. That last great ruler of the revived Roman Empire in the future. Remember, we saw that horn had a mouth that would speak boastful things. This person, who will be the last great ruler of the revived Roman Empire of the future, while God in heaven is setting up his court, ready to pour out his wrath upon this man and his Gentile dominion, this human ruler on the face of the earth will be spouting off all sorts of boastful, blasphemous things about himself against the true and the living God. He will be challenging the sovereign rule of the true Lord of the universe. But notice, he won't do it very long. For Daniel says, middle of verse 11, I kept looking until the beast was slain. The beast is the Roman Empire. I kept looking until the empire of this boastful ruler is destroyed, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, the lion, the bear, the leopard, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Now, what he's saying in verse 12 is a summary statement. He's indicating that when each of the previous three Gentile empires, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, were conquered by the succeeding Gentile empire, they were not totally annihilated from the face of the earth. They were simply assimilated into the new conquering Gentile empire, and each of those previous Gentile empires was allowed to continue existing as part of the new empire as long as God had designed for them to exist. But Daniel is being told here by contrast, when it comes time for the fourth empire, the Roman Empire, to fall, it will not continue to exist, being assimilated into the next empire that is to come. The revived Roman Empire will be totally annihilated, obliterated from the face of the earth, when it is destroyed in this judgment of God being portrayed here at the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Daniel goes on and introduces yet something new again in this heavenly scene of his vision. Verses 13 and 14, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Daniel had been observing God the Father as the Ancient of Days sitting upon the judgment throne in heaven. But now he sees a mysterious new figure presenting himself in heaven. One who is like a son of man who comes with the clouds of heaven. And this mysterious new figure walks up to the Ancient of Days, God the Father, on the judgment throne. And God the Father, as the judge and sovereign one over the universe and the world, gives to this Son of Man who comes with the clouds the authority and the power to rule the whole earth on behalf of God. This Son of Man who comes with the clouds of heaven is none other than the Messiah. Interestingly, ancient Hebrew scholars who lived even before the first coming of the Lord Jesus recognized that this character was the Messiah. And as a result of that, even in ancient Hebrew commentaries on Daniel chapter 7, when they came to deal with this Son of Man who comes with the clouds of heaven, the ancient rabbis adopted a title for the Messiah on the basis of this passage. They called the Messiah the Son of Man, the Man of the clouds. But let me point out two interesting things about this description, this Old Testament description of the coming Messiah. Notice, on the one hand, he is like a son of man, like an offspring of man. This is indicating that the coming Messiah would be human. There is his humanity. He is an offspring of man. But notice the Spirit of God as he moves Daniel to write this passage and record his vision, has Daniel say that he is like a son of man. The implication being that although he would be human, that would not be the totality of his existence and personhood. He would be more than just the offspring of man. What would be the rest of his being and personhood? Well, we're told that in the next expression, verse 13, that he comes with the clouds of heaven. Now that does not say too much to you and to me today in our modern world. But that statement would have spoken volumes to Jewish people in Daniel's day and in Jesus' day. Because to the ancient Jews, only God comes with the clouds of heaven. On the basis of Psalm 104, verse 3, where the psalmist declares that the clouds are the chariots of God, the ancient Jews were convinced that the clouds serve as the chariot only of absolute deity, and therefore only God comes with the clouds of heaven. And in light of that, as we're told here that the Messiah comes with the clouds of heaven, this is God's way of revealing that Messiah would not only be man, but Messiah would also be God as well. He would be both God and man, uniquely combined in one person. That expression that Messiah would come with the clouds of heaven posed tremendous problems to the ancient Jewish commentators. They knew it implied deity, but they struggled over that. If you were to read some of the ancient Hebrew commentators, you'd find some of them raising the questions. Can this mean that Messiah will be God as well as man? But that can't be. And they struggled, and they struggled, and they struggled over that. Interestingly, as you well know, the Lord Jesus, while he was here, repeatedly reached back to Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, and applied it to himself, and claimed again and again and again that he is the one of whom Daniel was speaking back there. He is the Son of Man who would come with the clouds of heaven. Now, Jesus used that reference many, many times. Let me take you just quickly to three of them. First, Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. Jesus in Matthew 24 has been talking about the coming tribulation period. He says, verse 29, "But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." He's quoting from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. And he's saying that Daniel 7:13 will be fulfilled by me after the tribulation period ends. At the time of my glorious second coming, I will come out of heaven with the clouds of heaven as the Son of Man, who will fulfill the prophecy of Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14. Look at Matthew chapter 25, verse 31. Again, Jesus is speaking. "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne." He's saying, after my second coming, that's when I will sit on a throne as a ruler and rule the world with the kingdom that was promised to be given to me by the Ancient of Days, back in Daniel chapter 7. Look at Matthew chapter 26. And in verse 63, Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin. Just a few more hours, he'll go to the cross. False accusers have been there to testify against him. Verse 63, Jesus kept silent in light of all these false accusations. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ or Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You've said it yourself."
Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Notice how the high priest and the Sanhedrin reacted. They knew immediately when they heard him say, I'm the Son of Man who comes with the clouds of heaven, what that implied. They knew that implied absolute deity. And right away, the high priest, verse 65, tore his robe, saying, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They answered and said, he is deserving of death. They knew the implication of that claim. They knew that by Jesus saying, I'm the Son of Man who will come with the clouds of heaven, he was claiming deity for himself. And to their way of thinking, for a man to claim deity was blasphemy. And such a person deserved the death penalty. He was going back repeatedly to Daniel chapter 7 and saying, I'm the one who will fulfill that prophecy. Notice here again, in Daniel 7, Christ is being promised the same kingdom that was described in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 by the stone cut out of the side of a mountain without hands. As I indicated in Daniel 2, fine Christian scholars disagree over this kingdom. What kind will it be and when will it be established? There have been some very fine Christians who have said this kingdom being promised here was set up by Jesus in his first coming. And that kingdom is the church. And it is the total fulfillment of this future kingdom being foretold in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. But notice, please, from the passages we read in Matthew 24 and Matthew 25 and Matthew 26, Jesus, reaching back to Daniel 7, is saying, this kingdom I will receive and I will rule over after the tribulation period, at the time of my glorious second coming to the face of the earth. This future kingdom of God being promised to the Messiah here has not yet taken place on planet earth. The church today is not that future kingdom being portrayed here, because Jesus himself is saying, this will be fulfilled in my second coming, after the tribulation period, when I, as the Son of Man, return with the clouds of heaven. Then I shall sit upon my throne and rule over the nations of the world. And it is at that time that he will destroy the last great form of Gentile world dominion on planet earth, which will be the future revived Roman Empire. We shall look at the rest of Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel has revealed to him even more details concerning these future events.